Welcome to our keynote presentation. I'm very excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Rain. She's a user experience designer and certified web accessibility professional, currently working at Google in Mountain View, and one of leaders for Drupal Accessibility Initiative. Rain has long been an active participant in the Los Angeles Drupal user group, including spearheading many community activities and projects. Rain was leading DrupalCon Minneapolis UX track team, and I had an honor to be part of that team. And this is where I had the opportunity to invite her to be our keynote speaker with her very interesting session designing for neurodiversity. And I'm very happy and very grateful that Rain has time to join us. Thank you, Rain.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oops. All right. Hopefully you are all seeing the slide deck with the captions. Awesome. Great. Getting started on a virtual presentation. So hello, and hello Stanford WebCamp. I'm so privileged to be here today, virtually connecting with all of you. Thank you for joining me from your homes, your bedrooms, your kitchens, perhaps your pajamas with your cats or your kids on your lap. And please don't be surprised if my kids, who are supposed to be napping but are actually screaming and yelling right now, walk in during this talk. We'll make do as best we can. I also really want to give a huge shout out to Stanford WebCamp for going virtual and making this happen. It's one of the first Drupal camps to really dive into this and make it happen. So I'm very impressed with what you all have done. So what we do as creators here now in today's world, creators of digital experiences has just become so much more important, so much more critical than it's ever been before in just the past couple of weeks. So I'm very, very honored to be able to be here and to talk about this subject that is near and dear to me with you. And we're going to talk about designing for neurodiversity and why it matters, and also why it falls into a category that goes beyond just thinking about good user experience design. We're going to start in 1995 when Neil Stephenson imagined a concept of a young lady's illustrated primer. This is from the Diamond Age. This primer is an interconnected tablet of sorts, and it's a personalized learning experience for the young girl who happens to pick it up. In this particular story, the primer itself is built for one girl, but a different style of picking it up, and the primer is able to adjust to the individual who ends up holding onto it. Even before that, in 1992, another sci-fi author, Kim Stanley Robinson, released the first book in a trilogy, the Mars trilogy. And in this trilogy, across these stories, his characters carry around these personal tablet-like devices that contain all of their information and enable them to stay interconnected with each other. Both of these concepts underscore the world that we live in today, even more so now, today, than when I created these slides about 3 weeks ago. We are able to stay connected with the entire world, to learn and grow through this invisible cloud of data that surrounds us. And if we're fortunate, we access this cloud with small personalized devices that we hold in our hands, on our laps. And we are here now in this strange digital space where we are trying to connect and learn from each other because we, the people here today, are the ones who are building the experiences that are being accessed on these devices. And we know that it is critical that these experiences are accessible. If what we create cannot be used by somebody who is blind or motor impaired, thinking of physical disabilities which are tangible, then we know that we are excluding that person from what we create. we're perhaps shutting them out from having their own agency. Again, this is so much more true now, today, than when I created these slides. We're seeing this play out now in real time, in distance learning, in working remotely, and in simply staying connected through this period of strange isolation. We also know that universal design is important. We will never know the limitations of the invisible people who use the experiences that we build. We don't know what technology, what physical location, what environment, what temporal distractions, or what physical condition these individuals are in. So we want to make sure that what we build is as flexible and open as possible for everyone who comes to it. And the benefits of universal design are something that we widely understand and value. Even those who don't need a wheelchair ramp, for example, because they have some kind of a motor disability, they may enjoy using some kind of a strolling surface, a ramp of some kind, or a longer ramp going up into a museum, because these surfaces enable them to stroller, or pull something behind them, or simply walk more slowly than they would otherwise. This is what we consider the curb cut effect, where accessibility itself might be built for somebody in need of a particular technology, but ultimately benefits everyone in some way. But as simple as this is to kind of comprehend on an emotional and personal level, and as concrete as it can be once we start digging into the physical disabilities and how to accommodate for them in our designs, there is a far more nuanced consideration that we need to start to make. And we as technologists across the world and in this industry, as digital experience creators, are only just beginning to think about this and try to understand what it means. And that question is, what does it mean to design for neurodiversity? Why actually be different from just standard good design? Well, the first step in trying to understand what that question even means and how to begin to grapple with it is to actually take a look at what neurodiversity itself means. So let's go back to the Mars trilogy. This story, this three-part story of 100 colonists going to Mars and turning it into this livable environment. There's one character in this trilogy named Sax Russell, and he begins the story as this brilliant but emotionally detached introvert with dyslexia. Later in the series, due to a stroke, he develops aphasia, which is a cognitive disability that can make it incredibly difficult for somebody to accurately convey the word that they intend. Sax, in spite of being different in these ways, is chosen as one of the first 100 humans to colonize Mars. Spurred by the depth of his passion for what he thinks the world, or in this case, Mars, should be like, he leads a revolution. He is empowered to do so by the technology that he carries at his side. Technology which is able to reframe itself for his unique way of thinking so that he is able to take advantage of his strengths and it will accommodate for his weaknesses. Sax's brain is measurably different from the other 99 of his colleagues in ways that can be mapped and medically diagnosed. He is no less intelligent and no smarter than any of his other colleagues. He is simply different. He is what we might call neurodivergent. Neurodiversity is typically defined as something that is measurable, a measurable biological difference in the way that the brain is wired to process things such as social interactions, intellectual understanding, and emotions and behaviors. It's also looked at frequently through the lens of something that we call the social model of disability. And a simplistic definition of what this means, of what the social model of disability means, is that disability is looked at from societal attitudes and systemic barriers as being the cause of the challenges that an individual faces, rather than thinking of it from the medical model, where it's considered a problem with the individual. And there's a link here on this slide, so when the slides are attached in the future, you're certainly more than welcome to follow through and learn more about this. But this can be highly controversial. And if we're going to design for neurodiversity, we also have to understand that there are many different ways of thinking about neurodiversity, and how neurodiversity should be considered. I'm not going to spend this talk going into the controversy or the different ways of thinking about neurodiversity in this manner. But there are some links here, again, that you may follow if you're interested in learning more. Instead, what we're going to try to do is take a look at some of the characteristics and how those map to experiences. So some common diagnoses that are typically considered part of the neurodiversity category include diagnoses such as autism or Asperger's, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, and ADHD. This is by far not an exhaustive list, and I've grouped them together merely for the purposes of examining how users interact and our design decisions later in this talk. About diversity that are very important for us to understand as designers. First of all, it is undeniable. What this means is that neurodivergent brains are biologically different. We cannot pretend that somebody is not an autistic individual. One cannot be trained out of the way that their brain works. If an individual is born with dyslexia, they have dyslexia and will have it for their entire life. They may be able to learn different ways of processing data and understanding concepts that they read, but they are still individuals with dyslexia. Another important thing about neurodiversity is that it is often what we call a hidden disability. You may not know that a number of the people who might even be very close to you have some kind of a neurodivergent diagnosis. You also may be aware that you yourself might benefit from seeing somebody and realizing that you might need a neurodivergent diagnosis. If there are challenges that you work your way through on a constant basis, it might be that your brain is actually decoding information differently from how it's typically presented. Additionally, another important thing about neurodiversity is that those who are neurodivergent but have been able to develop ways of hiding it enough so that they appear neurotypical to those around them, these individuals don't want to call themselves out as being neurodivergent. They want to hide it so that people don't treat them or think of them differently. Another thing about neurodiversity is that it is exceptionally common. 1 in 5, approximately 1 in 5 is the understood number that have neurodivergent diagnoses. And I want to call out the way that I worded this. I didn't say 1 in 5 individuals are neurodivergent. I said 1 in 5 have neurodivergent diagnoses. It is becoming widely understood that neurodiversity is largely underdiagnosed because we have long accepted that neurodivergence appears more frequently in men than it does in women. Experts are starting to realize, however, that these tendencies or these ways of recognizing who may or may not have neurodivergent behaviors is actually the result more of bias than of science. So we're starting to realize that it's very possible that women are largely underdiagnosed. Also, neurodiversity is extremely diverse. We're having a conversation right now about this large blanket of people. A neurodivergent individual's way of interacting with the world can vary by many factors. One of those factors, a very key one, is their specific diagnosis. Within each neurodivergent diagnosis, there might be many sort of subcategories or types. And a really good example would be dyslexia. And when somebody has dyslexia, they might have any number of or a combination of different types of dyslexia, such as some of the most common, which are phonological versus surface dyslexia. With phonological dyslexia, an individual may have trouble identifying the sounds within a word and being able to actually read something out loud that might have multiple syllables, or they might start mixing up those syllables when they're trying to decode them. With service dyslexia, the individual may not actually have challenges sounding out words, but what can happen is that a word that is incredibly common for them, one that they've heard many, many times, suddenly has no meaning. Then just thinking, what is that? Why? I don't know. Other things that can really impact an individual and their experience as a neurodivergent individual and in interacting with the world are their age, their social and familial status, their financial stability, access to technology and their physical location, where they are on the spectrum. Neurodiversity and the diagnoses that fall within this come on a very broad spectrum. We've probably all heard the terms mild autism versus severe autism, and we can kind of picture the difference that somebody might interact with the world based on whether they're mild or severe. But the other thing that we also need to remember when it comes to neurodiversity is that one of the biggest influences in how they interact with the world and how an individual who is neurodivergent might be or work through experiences comes from their individual personality and interests, just like any neurotypical individual. Okay, so
Jean. Hello, Jean.
Yep.
Hi, this is one of the moderators. We're noticing you're cutting in and out. We think we might be able to stop your video, but let you keep talking. Would you mind?
Okay.
All
Yeah,
right,
that's
we're going
great.
to do that.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Rain. My bad.
Okay. Thank
Okay,
you.
Go ahead. You're welcome.
Okay, so what does this mean? We build universally accessible designs and we're done, right? Not exactly. It's not that simple because everyone's brains work differently and have different strengths and weaknesses. Some of the solutions that we might design for one way of thinking might actually be contraindicated by solutions that we should consider designing another. So let's take a closer look at strengths and weaknesses of different types of neurodivergent brains and see if we can start to understand and parse what this means. How do we design for neurodiversity? The first part of being able to design for neurodiversity, aside from understanding what neurodiversity itself means, is to understand the ways of decoding and encoding that are used by neurodivergent brains. This is also deeply complex, and there's no way that I'm going to talk about all of that in the scope of this talk, but we can certainly look at some common patterns. So we're going to start by looking at a few characteristics, and we'll start with these groupings that I put up earlier. We'll switch out these groupings into categories that are more useful for a designer so that we can start to think of them in terms of how we would actually look at our experiences. We have individuals who hyper-focus on small details. We have individuals for whom everything blends together and becomes very difficult to decode. And then we have individuals who are easily distracted. Next, we're going to map these characteristics to real people, or real imaginary people, so that we can think about how these individuals might interact with user experiences. We're going to look at Sam, who has autism, June, who has ADHD, and Linda, who has dyslexia. We're going to start with Sam. For Sam, who hyperfocuses on details, errors are very obvious and can be very distracting. Vague and metaphorical language can require extra effort to understand because the literal meaning stands out. For example, if you say to Sam that somebody is green, meaning that they're new to the job, she might actually hear that somebody is the color green. She also will look at illogical flows and unexpected events and find them to be frustrating because they are perceived as errors. An example of this might be if you scroll to the bottom of a page and there's an arrow pointing left. If she clicks an arrow pointing left, but it scrolls the user back up to the top of the page, the behavior on the page is behaving differently from what was expected based on the affordance of the arrow itself. But before we continue to look at our other users, I want to momentarily reframe our way of thinking. Sam's characteristics aren't necessarily negatives. They do directly impact the way that she experiences the world and the way that she interacts with information and experiences themselves. But they can also be positives for her depending on how we frame them. For example, instead of hyper-focusing on details, Sam is detail-oriented. She quickly identifies errors, she recognizes when language is vague and might cause miscommunication, and she recognizes when flows are not logical, and she can provide better solutions for easier wayfinding. We're not going to do this for all of our users in the interests of time, but I did want to make sure that this is clear. Let's look at Linda briefly. Linda blends everything together. Large paragraphs blur together, and it's difficult for her to identify and pull out key information. She relies heavily on personalized font size and font size and family settings in order to make sure that it's easier for her to read the words. She also looks for images to support the way that she understands and parses information, and relies on common patterns to navigate experiences. June, who's easily distracted, can be distracted by two competing elements, especially if some of them are moving. She can be distracted by notifications. She can also be distracted by calls to action that come too early in a flow, in a user flow. For example, perhaps she's paying her energy bill and she's getting to the point of actually submitting her bill payment when she sees a call to action to learn how to conserve energy. She might be inclined to click on that call to action and then forget that she never completed the payment. She can be compelled to take care of things immediately when they start coming up, taking her away from whatever else she might have been part of. When we look at these characteristics, we can see some high-level design themes that we can hold on to and start to think about when we're making sure that we design for neurodivergent individuals. At a very high level, we can tell and we can look to guidelines to validate that we should use clear, concise, correct language. We should avoid ambiguity in our designs and in the labels that we use. We should use white space and other techniques to ensure that user focus is driven to the main call to action. And of course, we should carefully test and proofread for errors. We also need to make sure that we provide sufficient time for users when time is an important factor. And we need to make it easy for users to correct their own errors. Doing all of these things will help all of the users that we just talked about, and also really anyone else using our experiences. That's the good news. Doing all of this will also have another curb cut effect of helping non-readers, early readers, non-native language readers, people who are tired or hungry, oh, not hungry, in a hurry, and so many more, maybe if they're hungry too. But ultimately, neurodivergent users can often be very different from what we might consider good user experience or nice design. And more importantly, as with accessibility in general, our solutions for one type of use case might actually be counter-indicative of a solution for another type of use case. And we're going to look very quickly at what this might mean. We're going to take an experience that's familiar to a lot of the people who are joining today, the Drupal user dashboard. So looking at the Drupal user dashboard itself, overall, this does fairly well from an accessibility standpoint. It's fairly accessible to screen readers. It has good semantic markup. It doesn't rely on color alone to convey information, and everything is fairly clear and straightforward. But if we start to look at this from the perspective of Sam, first of all, we're grateful that everything is clear, ambiguous. But let's take a quick look off to the left side, the very left side, part of it that's actually cropped off here, where there are the security advisory names, the SA-contrib-2020-00 number. These are very useful for Sam because they're predictable, they're meaningful. When she looks at one of those security advisories based on its name, she has a lot of information about it, and that means a lot to her. On the other hand, she might see this number, this very large number of 155 new in one of the issues, the one that's green, that's circled here. This can be distracting for Sam because it means that something in her mind, it's something that is an issue. There's so many things there that need to be addressed. So even though this is a fixed issue in her issue queue, she might start to hyper-focus on it. And we have Linda. For Linda, the use of the white space here might be very helpful. The color coding might also be very helpful to her because it helps her quickly identify more information about the text on the screen. But the density of the text is a little bit difficult to parse through and make sure that she knows what words she's reading at any given point in time. And even more potentially problematic for her, the same security advisory naming convention that was helpful to Sam can be distracting or difficult for Linda because the shapes of every single one of them are identical. So for her, trying to find the one that she actually needs might become problematic. Looking at this from June's perspective, the new feature that's here on these issues that telling her that there are so many new comments can be really because it helps know what she has or hasn't looked at any given point in time. On the other hand, all of the color coding that's going on here, the color coding that was very helpful to Linda in enabling her to have some high-level information about what she's looking at, can be distracting for June because there's so much visual information on the screen. So what this means really is that there's no simple answer to how we have one clean list, sort of a checklist for how we're going to design for neurodivergent users. Each and every challenge that we listed could potentially be demotivating enough to stop a neurodivergent user. I'm giving. Okay, go see. Go back. I'm sorry. I have toilet paper right here for you, kids. All right, here you go. Here you go. And close the door, please. So perfect. So each of these challenges can be demotivating enough to stop a neurodivergent individual from being a community contributor. But the obvious solutions themselves to make the experience better, some of them contradict the solution for another one of these users. So what is it that we do? Well, first we have to understand that we won't always be perfect, and we need to learn to adapt. We need to accept that we might make mistakes and hear feedback. From there, our best chance of success is to simply be aware of these challenges and to actively make them part of our thinking, to recognize them as part of our process. We need to include neurodiversity in the user experience process itself from the very beginning. This means including neurodivergent characteristics in our user personas. If these characteristics are part of the people that you're designing from, you will naturally consider their needs as you go. We also need to journey map their experiences through the process. And as we continue to think about and iterate on features or develop more code, we need to continue to test and journey map against those experiences with those users. As we do this, we'll find potential problems along the way and we'll be able to decide early how to address them. But the other thing that we really need to do is invite neurodivergent users to the conversation and make them part of the process. We need to ask neurodivergent users from a diverse array of labels, quote unquote, or experiences. Ask them what they need, request their feedback, and include them in user testing. And most importantly, expect to be wrong a lot of the time, really, and be prepared to shift as needed. Recognize that we're not alone in this experience of trying to figure out how to design for neurodiversity. There are a lot of people in tech that are now trying to figure this out. And there's some good research that's out there that can be accessed. And this slide, which you'll have access to after the talk, has links to some of this research. The WCAG Working Group for Cognitive Accessibility is active and doing this research right now. And that means because they're releasing their notes publicly, they're engaging with the public, they're posting it all on w3c.org. That means that any one of us can actually be part of that process and try to help figure out what those guidelines might look like. We also want to start thinking about how our designs can maximize users' strengths.
I think we can start. So first, I think I make some summary. So as far as budget was.
All right. So we need to maximize our users' strengths and think about how our designs can do that. Some of that means thinking about personalization and allowing users to dictate what their experiences will be like as much as possible. We also want to remember that every quote unquote challenge that we consider for neurodivergent individuals can actually be a strength if we think of them differently. Going back to this slide with Sam, who is detail-oriented and quickly identifies errors, recognizes when language is vague and might cause miscommunication, and can help us improve our wayfinding in our applications. So then what is designing for neurodiversity? It's complicated. It's far from cookie cutter and necessary. This is relevant to at least 1 in every 5 people around the world. But it also doesn't have to be overwhelming, because really the first step is understanding and also destigmatizing. Neurodiversity is normal and it can be awesome. I started this story with Sax Russell, who's a fictional character with dyslexia and aphasia, who led a revolution. Then I went on to make up 3 fun little characters. But let's look at some real life neurodivergent individuals who had a massive impact on our world. Pokemon was founded by an individual with autism who had a passion for collecting bugs. Octavia Spencer credits her incredible imagination with being an individual with dyslexia. Temple Grandin is this very fascinating professor with autism who has helped the cattle industry figure out how to based on her own experiences with anxiety as an autistic individual. And Simone Biles, a gymnast who inspires so many, has ADHD, which may very well be at the core of her passion for physical challenge. So it's very important that we destigmatize. And we also need to recognize that neurodiversity does not correlate to intelligence, competence, or talent. And when we say it does not correlate to intelligence, competence, or talent, we also need to let go of the idealized image that we have of, say, the individual with autism who is an absolute genius, because that is not fair to individuals with autism. They are individuals with their own intelligence, competence, and talent that is unimpacted by who they are as an autistic person. We need to celebrate and benefit rather than pity, hide, or compensate for neurodiversity. Designing for neurodiversity is about inviting neurodivergent individuals to fully participate. And we stand a lot to gain from doing this, especially now more than ever, when our entire world is in the process of changing from the one that we knew 2 or 3 weeks ago. Thank you so much. All right, well, I'm more than happy to take questions.
So we've got some people in the chat with their hands raised. I'm just going to go from the top from what I see. Rachel Hupp, you have your hand raised in the Zoom chat.
Hi there. Thank you very much. This is very informative. I think it was mentioned in the chat about we would want to make our sites as accessible as possible. And I'm wondering from your perspective, would that create a problem as far as what done looks like, where it would take longer to actually get the product to market, as it were?
Not necessarily. That's a really excellent question. So in terms of user-centered design, really thinking from making the best experiences possible for the user, what we need to think about is iteration and feedback. So knowing what the priorities are, knowing what can be released right now, getting something to market, what maybe needs to be off for a next iteration, and always very carefully determining when you realize what aspects of a product need to be accessible and in what ways, just carefully considering who you're leaving out. So if along the way you realize you don't have the time or budget to make a certain set of changes that are clearly indicated, to try thinking about what you can do to help them in a smaller manner in order to make the experience a little bit more inviting, but then also to just recognize and be aware when you go to market who's being left out so that that can be compensated for in other ways.
Gotcha, that makes sense. Thank you.
And next we have, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Dwani Shah, who has their hand raised. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I had a question around just like the user personas, and when you're thinking about potential users, and I loved everything we talked about, and I started thinking about how this intersects with other identities that we're thinking of and we're designing for it, because you want to think about cultural awareness, you want to think about designing for across the genders. Just how do you see this playing into recognizing all of that diversity across all your users, and just talking about intersectionality? And yeah.
I love your question. And really, when it comes to inclusive design, inclusive and accessible design across the board, personas are really such an incredible tool. And starting with personas and what the users themselves might look like, it is going to be so helpful in enabling you to kind of think through that. I love, you know, the intersectionality, what you used in your question itself. When people that I work with, and I tend to create personas that we're going to work with, we try to be as diverse as possible in the range of characteristics of those personas. So we try to think about age, thinking about the sort of oldest to the youngest, and making sure that we have at least 3 broad ages represented. To insert some of these neurodivergent tendencies into 1 or 2 or all of our users, to insert accessibility elements, perhaps simply putting one of our users into a wheelchair in our minds can make a big difference, or saying, one of our users doesn't have use of their right arm, or they don't have use of their voice. Something that can enable you to just have them in your mind, and you can have 3 personas and still inject all of these aspects to say, this individual came here from Kazakhstan and is still learning English, is a doctor who's trying to learn English. If you're creating some kind of a medical site, and then you immediately think of all of the challenges that a doctor learning English might be facing in interacting with the world and whatever it is that you're creating for them. It'll make a big difference.
Thank you.
Next, it looks like Nikki Katz has raised their hand.
Right, yeah. So I was thinking that making sites as customizable as possible for different users seems really helpful. Like I have ADHD, so just like pages with a ton of content everywhere, promos and images and stuff is so distracting. To being able to like minimize everything that you see would be really helpful to me. But does that put the onus too much on the users, putting a whole bunch of different customizable settings? What's your opinion on that?
No, not necessarily. In fact, for a lot of this, because a lot of the solutions can kind of contraindicate other solutions, really one of the best things that you as a developer, that any team as a developer can do, is to ensure that the designs and the code are robust enough to understand and respect user preferences, which can be anything from a Chrome extension to third-party software that overlays on top of the user's experience. There are a lot of great tools out there that can be used, but they can only be used if the way that the application was coded and the designs themselves are flexible. And as long as that's true, as long as is there across the board and the site's CSS is not so rigid that it won't look at user preferences, and then there's a lot that the user will probably have already done themselves. One of the big challenges, though, is a lot of people who could benefit from these tools, first of all, don't realize that they're neurodivergent. So they haven't really thought to look for these tools. They just kind of think this is my way of being and nobody builds good products. So that kind of is terrible. So anything that you can do to help with the discoverability of the customizations that will work well with your tool can be great. But it's not a one-way. You as the designer are sort of required to make sure that your system works for everyone beautifully and automatically understanding the user's preferences and respecting how they might want to customize and making sure that what you produce is able to accommodate that. These are great questions. This is not easy. And I see a chat in the chat window, prefers reduced motion, reduce. Yeah, so the point there is there are user settings like prefers reduced motion so that you don't see as much motion on the screen. But you as a developer can easily build a site that doesn't respect prefers reduced motion, or even build a user experience as a designer that requires that motion for information, for critical information. And so if the user turns off the motion and now the motion doesn't happen, can the user still tell what they need to do or not? I see a link to Mars Trilogy popping up as well. These are great questions, thank you.
Well, it looks like it's about time to turn on, move to the next sessions. Is there anything else you want to say to wrap up?
Oh, just thank you. Thank you for having this. Thank you for inviting me. And I look forward to seeing whatever conversation comes out of this, and I will share the slide deck so that it can be posted as well.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful to have you.
Thank you.
People can go off mute and
Thanks
clap.
a lot, Ray.
Okay.